Spinosaurus, the biggest paleontological underdog story ever told, has earned its place among the most famous dinosaurian archetypes due to some new spectacular specimens and the incessant yapping of everyone's favorite hard-working paleontologists. However, despite all this work and the new fossil discoveries, much about this largest of theropod dinosaurs remains a mystery. The only way the mysteries of what it looked like will be solved is with a perfect whole specimen from the exact region where the original was found. Even then though, how it lived will remain elusive, but perhaps less than it is now. I've made no allusions to being personally burnt out on Spinosaurus talk, even making a never-ending series, which you should check out when you get the chance, and a brand new step in the process has been published, so let's take a gander. The new paper was authored by Nathan Marvold, Stephanie Baumgart, Daniel Vidal, Frank Fish, Donald Henderson, Evan Saita, and Paul Sereno, and saw publication in PLOS ONE. The first part of this paper runs through the various semi-recent scientific papers published since the discovery of the Moroccan specimen of what is tentatively called a Spinosaurus. The second part of the paper, which makes up the majority of the darn thing, is a lengthy critique of a paper published in 2022 by Matteo Fabri and colleagues in which they used the solidness or hollowness of certain bones in the skeletons of a bunch of animals to determine how aquatically adapted they were. Since the Marvold and Company paper is almost 80 pages long and does not add new information or evidence about Spinosaurus, I have decided to summarize the paper as succinctly as possible. So, without further ado, let's also go through a quick recap on the last 10 years of Spinosaurus science. Hold your nose. Spinosaurus was the first of its kind ever found. Paleontologist Ernst Stromer found it in Egypt in 1915. Those bones were glassed in World War II. Plenty of unhelpful bits and bobs were found across Egypt and Morocco until the early 2010s. Other Spinosaurs were found in the 1980s and 90s, with the most famous and complete example being the British Baryonyx, formally described in 1986 by paleontologist Alan Cherrig and Angela Milner. The pair described the remains of this heavily clawed animal in 1997, in which they offered some inferences on its possible ecology, hypothesizing it was a master of the transition between water and land. Then, others were found and described, like the Brazilian irritator in 1996, the Nigerian Suchomimus in 1998, the Brazilian Oshalaia in 2011, the Lao Ichthyovenator in 2012, and then over a handful of European members in the late 2010s and early 2020s. However, a serious and thorough exploration of the aquatic ecology of these animals was started in that 1997 Baryonyx paper. The next giant leap for Spinosaurus kind was the Moroccan discovery of a moderately complete specimen of an animal that seems extremely closely related to the original Spinosaurus remains, and the subsequent publication of those remains in 2014. That was when the authors, Nizar Ibrahim and colleagues, brought up the hypothesis that Spinosaurus was way more aquatic than anyone had ever thought before. As many may remember, the general consensus was that Spinosaurus was relatively similar in overall build to its close relatives, so it was reconstructed as it was in Jurassic Park 3, with huge muscular legs and arms, a thick typical theropod tail, basically just a big sailed Baryonyx. Ibrahim and friends put forth evidence to back up their hypothesis that Spinosaurus was semi-aquatic. Small nostrils that were closer to the eyes and top of the head than the tip of the snout, a small pelvis, small legs, heavy limb bones, long toes, flattened toe claws, and not a lot of movement in the tailbones. This team also threw in that they thought the animal would have been a quadruped. They got that from their calculations of the animal's center of mass, which their work found to be in front of the hips. Later research has found this placement to be inaccurate, so it is not the first and only known theropod dinosaur to evolve quadrupedality. In 2016, Jan Gimza, Robert Slay, and Ulrich Gimza published a paper about the sail of Spinosaurus maybe having something to do with mechanically helping the animal move around underwater to catch food. Dave Hone and Thomas Holtz threw the next paper volley in 2017, in which they summarized a bunch of older research and their own findings about all this Spinosaurus mess. They hypothesized that Spinosaurus was semi-aquatic and ate fish most of the time. The next year, Donald Henderson published his paper on the buoyancy, balance, and stability of Spinosaurus. He did some digital model tests and found that Spinosaurus had a center of mass directly over the hips, in opposition to the 2014 incorrect math from Ibrahim and others, and that Spinosaurus could float, but was not adapted for physically swimming since it couldn't maneuver itself very well. It would tip over on its side if it tried to really do much. Henderson marked the animal as unsinkable. Henderson concluded the animal was most likely as it was hypothesized in the 2000s, and what was hypothesized for baryonyx back in 1997. Moving on, we have another publication a year after that. Thomas Arden, Catherine Klein, Samir Juri, and Nicholas Longrich's 2019 paper, which examines the anatomy of the skull to find ecological adaptations. Their results found that the placement of the nose and eyes lined up well with a semi-aquatic animal, but the nostrils being closer to the eyes and top of the skull didn't really correlate well with semi-aquatic ecology. 2020 gave us the paper describing the nearly complete tail of the Spinosaurus specimen found in Morocco by Nizar Ibrahim and colleagues, this time authored by a huge multinational team. The tail of this Spinosaur had tall, thin, straight neural spines for the majority of the tail's length, before they quickly transitioned towards bending backwards. They also unusually had very small, rounded, and bulbous tips. These tail spines made it mechanically difficult for the animal to bend the tail from side to side in anything other than very broad arcs, not great for swimming effectively. Regardless, the 2020 paper on this new tail argued that the tail was great for swimming. They even experimented by using 2D plastic silhouettes of the fleshed tail, plus cutouts of a newt, crocodilian, and generic theropod tail for comparison, inside a water flume to test their hydrodynamics. Those tests concluded that the Spinosaurus tail was an adequate propulsive organ. With this, the 2020 team reinvented Spinosaurus as a semi-aquatic pursuit predator of almost exclusively aquatic prey, basically a big otter or crocodile rather than a heron. Paul Sereno and another huge group of scientists put out a rebuttal in 2022. They did another digital physics test for Spinosaurus and its relative Suchomimus, using accurate skeletal models that were scanned from real fossils and cast bones, and then digitally sculpted to make them work for the program. They also sculpted flesh reconstructions over those bones and used skeleton and flesh models to test drag, stability, center of mass, diving ability, and speed. Through all of those tests, this time more accurate than ever before, the team found that their results refuted the Ibrahim 2020 and 2014 papers. This 2022 work didn't say anything about whether or not Spinosaurus could wade into the water and catch fish, only that it was relatively poorly adapted for swimming, diving, and quickly lunging after prey, a la crocodilians, therefore making it not technically semi-aquatic. Finally, also in 2022, Matteo Fabbri and colleagues published a paper using statistics to determine the ecology and habits of animals based on the number of voids in their bones. The main purpose of the paper was to study Spinosaurus, but they used a data sample of dozens of animals from fossil and living records. Their results showed Spinosaurus and baryonyx as semi-aquatic pursuit predators. This brings us to the most recent Marivold paper. Fabbri and colleagues' 2022 work more specifically used the cross-sections of femori and ribs as the main physical data. Then, they stuck two characteristics to each animal's cross-section, flying and diving. Fabbri and team then put a numerical value to both of these characteristics to show how strong those characteristics are, 0, 1, and 2. With all of the living and extinct animals with known ecologies plotted on the graphs, they could then estimate where unknown ecology extinct animals would be placed based on measured data, like the bone cross-sections. Because this is in the field of statistics, lines were drawn along the graphs to show different data fields that individual critters would fall in or out of for better classification. However, Meyervold team found that this approach wasn't that great because many animals with known ecologies would end up falling in the wrong data field, which means it doesn't have strong predictive power for extinct animals with unknown ecologies. In fact, Marvold and friends found more than a few issues with the steps that Fabry and team used to get their conclusions. Heavy bones. One of the variables used by the Fabry team was bone compactness. In simpler terms, they cut femori and ribs in half and photographed the cross-section, then averaged about how many voids there were in the bone. Animals on land generally have more hollow bones, while animals that need to sink, whether that be fully aquatic animals or just semi-aquatic animals, generally have thicker and less hollow bones. So, it seems like a good variable to measure to see how aquatic an animal is. Interestingly, as Marvold points out in their paper, the bone density used in the context of the Fabry paper referred more to how dense the femur and rib are as a whole rather than how dense the bone material is. An issue brought up by Marvold et al. 2024 is that Fabry et al. 2022 didn't seem to have enough nuance regarding the hypothesis they used as the backbone for their inferences about the compactness of bone. By that, Marvold et al. 2024 mean the hypothesis, the bone ballast hypothesis, is explained by animals evolving denser bones as ballast for a semi-aquatic lifestyle, but there is more to it than that. There are two ways to get denser bones. One way is pachyostosis, which is a thickening of the outside of the bone. The other way is osteosclerosis, which is a thickening of the inside of the bone. Pachyostosis would result in an animal with really big, chunky bones that are dense, while osteosclerosis may result in an animal with relatively normal-looking bones that are extremely dense on the inside. And of course, both are often adapted in conjunction. However, the nuance here comes from the fact that the denser your skeleton becomes, the heavier your entire self becomes. The heavier your entire self becomes, the less able you are to move around easily. Bone compactness becomes an iffy variable to use because most animals have variability in bone compactness across their skeletons. For example, whales generally have more compact bones in their jaws, humeri, and sternum. They aren't super dense throughout. Dense, compact, ballast-ready bones are good for critters that move slowly and eat things that cannot run away super fast, like manatees, or for animals that live close to the transition between water and land, something like the sea otter, that generally floats but will dive down in shallow water to grab some shellfish for dinner. In other words, not something that was assumed for Spinosaurus in the semi-aquatic pursuit predator model. This shows itself in the statistical analyses conducted by Fabry et al. 2022, as some modern animals were placed into data fields that don't match how they work in nature. Further issues pointed out by Marvold et al. 2024 involved the critters included in Fabry et al.'s 2022 dataset. They used the hippo, pygmy hippo, common tapir, Malayan tapir, beaver, European vole, American mink, Pyrenean desman, American alligator, and Nile crocodile. The problem here is that hippos, pygmy hippos, common tapirs, Malayan tapirs, beavers, and European voles are herbivorous animals that don't forage for their food underwater. They spend a lot of time in the water and are secondarily adapted for this lifestyle, but it's for other reasons than foraging. A criticism that Fabry et al. Recounted by redefining subaqueous foraging as a catch-all term for animals that spend any amount of time submerged in water, which would defeat the purpose of the stat test for extinct fauna. On top of that, Marvold points out that the Pyrenean desman and American mink are carnivorous semi-aquatic animals that also don't catch and eat their prey in the water. Most of their prey are terrestrial. The gator and croc are also hard to categorize as subaqueous foragers, as they take most of their prey from land via lunging out of the water, catching it, and then drowning it. Obviously, crocodilians will take any prey, so they do often consume aquatic prey, but the point here being made by Marvold et al. Is that they shouldn't be used as examples of subaqueous foragers. Plus, crocs change what they eat and how as they age, something that cannot be considered by using only adult bones in a stat analysis. Overall, the very foundation the 2022 study is built on seems vague and shaky. Heavy bones and airy bodies. The bone ballast hypothesis involves thickening bones for ballast. However, it does not consider pneumaticity, which is how airy a skeleton is. By airy, I mean air sacs. Bones are not full of literal voids of air, but air sacs that contain the air. Dinosaur skeletons are very airy, which is one of the big reasons for their success and allowed them to get as big as they did. Marvold et al. 2024 point out that non-avian theropod dinosaurs generally had very airy axial skeletons, the head, spinal column, and ribs. Spinosaurus specifically had the airiest spinal column of all of the Spinosaurs, and a super airy and buoyant spinal column and ribcage would most likely far outweigh any benefit from very heavy, dense limb bones. Marvold et al. Also note that living birds that do not pursue their prey for long periods of time under the water, like pelicans, have normal to very pneumatic skeletons. In contrast, birds that pursue their prey underwater for long periods, whether flightless or not, have much denser skeletons. Think penguins, cormorants, and grebes. This makes perfect sense, since you would absolutely need to be able to sink and stay under long enough to catch your grub before buoying back up to the surface. But if you just snap your huge pouched face underwater at big congregations of fish, like the pelican, then you would definitely need to be able to snap back to the surface relatively quickly. So, to get a good idea of how sinkable a Spinosaurus is, one would need to consider the variable pneumaticity across the skeleton, fleshed out body, and the air sacs that run through the body, something Fabry et al. 2022 obviously didn't. Marvold et al. 2024 even make note that trying to do all of that would be incredibly tricky and a lot of work due to having to construct a bunch of math to account for everything, as well as accurate 3D models of the skeleton, flesh, and air sac system for every single animal used in the data sample. A body mass misses. To cover their bases, Marvold et al. 2024 looked to other variables that may have biased the Fabry et al. 2022 results. One is that burrowing animals tended to have more compact bones, most likely an adaptation against the stresses and strains of constantly using their limbs. Some arboreal animals also had compact bones. Marvold et al. 2024 don't extrapolate as to why, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is to reinforce the limbs for holding up the body weight and maybe for protecting the animal if it were to fall. The team also took their attention to mass. It seems there is a correlation between mass and bone compactness. You see, the issue is that terrestrial and amphibious animals have adapted lightweight axial skeletons and dense limb bones, so it is unhelpful to try and use it as a predictor of ecology. For example, many large-bodied landlubbers have these adaptations, but so do hippos, so it seems to not really mean anything. Spinosaurus was damn near the largest theropod dinosaur to ever live and probably had a mass appropriate of this size. So, as Marvold et al. 2024 state, the evolution of large body size and mass may be better correlated to the light axial skeleton and heavy limb bones rather than a semi-aquatic pursuit predator ecology, especially when all of the other variables present in Spinosaurus disagree with, or at least don't support, the semi-aquatic pursuit predator thing. Marvold et al. 2024 also note the use of many very small animals in the Fabry et al. 2022 dataset. To lessen the bias of the data regarding large dinosaurs such as Spinosaurus, you'd think the data should be collected from animals that are physiologically more alike than different. Unfortunately for the bone ballast hypothesis used by Fabry et al. 2022, there are other ways that critters can get the ballast they need to dive. As Marvold et al. 2024 write, many animals gobble down stones to weigh them down aside from their use as after-dinner digestives. Crocs, plesiosaurs, dinosaurs, and most likely plenty of archosaurs fell victim to this fad. Hell, even birds do this one simple trick to gain weight today. This would be an interesting thing to study, whether or not gastroliths of certain amounts would be enough to sink a given dinosaur that had vaguely amphibious traits in its bones. Marvold et al. 2024 leave the body mass equals hard bones thing as an unknown. It's unknown whether these animals got big to have big bones for land living or water living, but the fact this unknown exists shows that there are a bunch of things going all funky and haywire with Fabry et al. 2022. Data is a doozy. So, according to Marvold et al. 2024, the data selection is bad, but so is the data composition. They have a problem with Fabry et al. 2022 using MD, or mean deviation. Fabry et al. 2022 may have used MD to get an idea of mean body mass in their dataset, using the diameter of femuri across their sample as a proxy for mass. Marvold et al. 2024 explained that this is not good because none of the extinct animals used in the sample have great body mass examples, since most Spinosaurs are fragmentary, and also because the majority of living animals used in the sample are way smaller than the Spinosaurs. Marvold et al. 2024 basically show that the use of MD in the 2022 analysis does not help explain anything. Fabry et al. 2022 also included flying birds in their dataset. Marvold et al. 2024 point out that this is also not good because it is entirely unnecessary and could have risked adding in random variation across the sample, since obviously none of the dinosaurs in the data sample, the study's main subjects, could fly. Whales need to float. Fabry et al. 2022 excluded many deep-diving animals from their dataset because it would have skewed the results. This would have happened because these deep-diving animals, such as whales, seals, and marine reptiles, have airy bones. They need many of their bones to be airy to get to the surface quickly enough to breathe. Additionally, Marvold et al. 2024 found that using any flippered animals in the dataset is odd because Spinosaurs all had terrestrial limbs, thus making it inconsistent. Despite that, Fabry et al. 2022 confusingly kept in some plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, nothosaurs, and penguins, critters that deep-dived and or had flippers and flukes. Then, for some reason, they removed a critter like Desmostylus, which was a four-legged mammal with no flippers or flukes and did not deep dive. What does it all mean? Boiled down, Marvold et al. 2024 find the work of Fabry et al. 2022 to be highly inconsistent and doesn't actually prove anything about the ecology and lifestyle of the Spinosaurs. They concluded that Spinosaurus was a subaqueous forager and that Suchomimus was not, but due to the flaws in the data and method lined out by Marvold et al. 2024, none of this can actually be concluded. This doesn't therefore mean that Spinosaurus was definitely a fully terrestrial animal either, only that the subaqueous forager hypothesis cannot be supported with the data and methods used. Sweet. Cool. Hopefully I don't have to talk about Spinosaurus again for a while. Then again, I'm a glutton for punishment. For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, like this video, drop a comment in the comment section below, and hit the bell icon to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching.